Chapter 25. Tessa thought she'd done something wrong. Of course I'd messed this up too, she thought. Can't even press a button properly. But then she noticed the deck seat hadn't budged either. Deck was hitting the eject button on her armrest again and again and again and screaming out, come on, eject! And Gideon was over by the door, pounding on the latch there just as doggedly, and failing just as completely. Alert, a mechanical sounding voice called from the computer. You are hereby put on notice that all control of this plane has been transferred to the Eastham military. No system will function without our permission. Deck kept pounding on her eject button. Gideon slumped against the wall. It's no use, he said in a dead voice. They're not going to let us escape. Then we hide, Deck exclaimed. Come on, Tessa, into the closet. She already had her seatbelt off and was halfway out of her chair when the mechanical voice sounded again. Lieutenant Pilot Thrall, the voice boomed. Please confirm presence of 2 civilian passengers. Tessa Stilfin and Dekaterina Patel. Is that correct? Dekaterina, Tessa repeated numbly. Who's... Oh, Dek? She stared at Dek's spiky hair and ragged, oversized clothes, which were now filthy as well after all Dek's work on the plane engine and with the fuel tanks. Applying the fancy name Dekaterina to Dek seemed so much like a mistake that Tessa almost forgot that her own name had been called out too. Shh, Dek whispered to Tessa. Then she turned to Gideon and commanded, Lie. Gideon gave a minimal shrug, barely bothering to move his shoulders up and down. They already know, he said. They've got cameras out there. He pointed toward the windows. They can see in well enough to identify all of us. You think it's going to matter if I tell the truth or a lie? They can hear us, too. He looked at the computer screen and muttered, Yes, presence of 2 civilians confirmed. Deck remained half up and half down, as if considering all of this. Please resume all seatbelt usage, the mechanical voice said. Dekaterina Patel, please return to your seat. Deck sat, a stunned look on her face. There are only 2 seatbelts and 3 people, Tessa said. What are you going to do about that? Stupid, 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 she told herself. Why try to antagonize the military when even Deck was taking a sit-down-and-shut-up approach? Because Gideon isn't going to take care of himself, she thought, so someone else has to. Lieutenant Pilot Thrall, you are instructed to tie yourself to the center column, the mechanical voice said. That is an order. Without a word, Gideon pulled the parachute from his back and refashioned the straps into a makeshift belt, lashing himself to the center column. Nobody spoke as the plane sped up. They can see us. They can hear us. What good would talking do? Tessa wondered. Still, she started trying to catch the gaze of Deck or Gideon, hoping one of them would convey, and it could convey in a glance, we're going to be all right. I've got everything figured out. Or, I'll watch out for you. Or even just, at least we're still alive. At least we're in this together. But Gideon had his eyes closed, and Deck was staring intently at the computer screen and the instrument panel, observing every change in altitude and velocity. Several times she even reached out for the controls, drawing back her hand only when the controls jerked themselves out of her grasp. After the fifth or sixth time Deck tried this, proving yet again that she couldn't change anything, the plane began to angle gently downward all by itself. We're going to land? Deck murmured. Where? Behind her, tied to the column, Gideon answered without opening his eyes. Headquarters, he said. Military headquarters. What will they do to us? Tessa asked, and she was ashamed that her voice came out in a panicky squeak. Gideon just shook his head. Deck went back to staring. The plane began to drop out of the sky so rapidly that Tessa had to tell herself they wouldn't crash us into the ground on purpose. If nothing else, they wouldn't want to damage the plane. Would they? And I thought the autopilot emergency landing was rough, Deck murmured. She raised her voice. Hello out there. Don't you know you have to land planes differently with people on board? The plane seemed to hover in the air for a long moment before angling downward again. Now Tessa felt like a feather floating gently on a breeze. Thank you, Deck muttered. Gideon stayed silent, his face as pale and sweaty as when he'd run from receiving the Medal of Honor. And then, before Tessa knew it, they were on the ground. The plane pulled up to a stop and the engine clicked off. The door sprang open. Deck was looking back at Gideon. I always think there's more dignity in walking out to meet your fate under your own power, rather than being dragged off in chains, she said. Don't you? For a moment, Tessa thought Gideon hadn't even heard Deck, but then he leaned forward and began doggedly picking at the knots in the rope tied around him. Tessa eased her own seatbelt off. She felt antsy and tense. What happened to people who stole airplanes from the military? What happened to people who sneaked out into enemy territory and then came back? Tessa didn't have the slightest idea, because she'd never heard of anybody doing such a thing. Should she beg and plead and say, "Look, I never meant to do anything wrong. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know the plane was stolen"? Or would that just make Gideon and Deck look guiltier? Two men and two women in light blue uniforms stepped up to the door of the airplane. "We will escort you to the general's office," one of the men said. Tessa saw the contrast between their cheap-looking uniforms and the heavy, stiff cloth of Gideon's uniform. She decided that these four were low-level flunkies, not anyone who would be making decisions. She tried to read in their faces some hint of what they thought was going to happen to her and Gideon and Deck, but their expressions were blank. They probably don't know any more than I do, Tessa thought. Gideon finished untying his knots and silently turned to follow one of the men. Deck and then Tessa trailed after him. The uniformed women walked on either side of them, and the other man walked behind them. Like a walking cage, Tessa thought. She couldn't see any sign that the four escorts were carrying weapons, but that didn't mean they weren't. Anyway, she was sure that the hallway they stepped into had cameras and listening devices. If the military had been able to see and hear what Tessa, Gideon, and Deck were doing on the airplane, they could certainly see and hear everything in their own headquarters. The hall led into another hall, and then another one. Tessa gave up trying to keep track of the pattern of intersections and corners and curves. Maybe Gideon and Deck were able to do that. Maybe they were just as lost as she was. The hall seemed designed as a maze intended to confuse any outsiders. At one point, Tessa was almost certain they'd turned to the right 3 times, possibly even bringing them back to the section they'd been in before. But maybe it just seemed that way because all the halls looked alike, gray and utilitarian. And then the hallway started to look nicer, with carpet on the floor and lighter gray paint. The plaques on the walls they passed were fancier. After a long stretch of no turns, the man leading the way turned to the right. Gideon froze, and Tessa and Deck almost ran into him. "What?" Gideon asked. "General Walsh's office is that way." He pointed straight ahead. So he had been keeping track. He did know where they were. The blue uniformed escorts looked impassively at him. "We're not taking you to General Walsh," the man in the front said, barely bothering to turn around. "Our orders are to take you to General Kantoff." "But General Kantoff is in charge of the entire military. He's the head commander," Gideon protested. This is just a pilot's issue." "We have our orders," the man in the front said. He kept walking. Gideon stumbled, going around the corner, and Deck and Tessa both reached out to catch him. He shook off their hands. "I'm fine," he mumbled. He looked wild-eyed and desperate again, as if he might do anything. "Careful," Deck whispered. "Our lives are on the line here, too." Did she think they were all going to get executed? Was that the punishment for stealing a military plane and flying it into enemy territory? Whatever Deck thought, her words had an impact on Gideon. He straightened up, his posture changing into an exact copy of the escorts in front of him. He started walking again. When Gideon caught up with the lead escort, he leaned forward and told the man, "Deck and Tessa didn't have anything to do with entering enemy airspace. Let them go." The lead escort kept his head facing forward. He didn't break his stride. "That would violate orders," he said. "We have to follow orders." They reached the end of the hall. Here there was only one door in an entire expanse of wall. The door was solid wood, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, bigger and more impressive than any other door they'd passed before. Tessa felt smaller and more insignificant than ever. She wanted to shrink down and hide behind Gideon. No, she wanted to shrink down and disappear completely, perhaps between the two strands of carpet fiber. But she noticed a curious thing. Gideon, the four blue uniformed escorts, and even Deck all stood taller approaching the imposing door, as if their instincts told them to puff up their chests and try to look bigger. Even more proof that they belong in the military and I don't, Tessa thought. She expected someone to knock at the door or just open it, but apparently that wasn't the protocol. Everyone just stood there in formation, waiting. "Yes?" A disembodied voice floated out from the speaker behind the door. "Officer McCutcheon, Squad D, reporting as ordered, with Lieutenant Pilot Gideon Thrall and 2 civilians," the lead escort said, saluting the door. There must be cameras, Tessa thought. Someone's watching every bit of this. She resisted the urge to crane her neck and look around to locate all the cameras and listening devices in the hallway. They were probably too well hidden for her to find anyway. And then she forgot all about that because the door began to swing open. "Squad D dismissed," the voice barked from the speaker. For the first time, the escorts seemed to falter. They exchanged puzzled glances. "But don't we have to actually walk with the subjects into your the lead escort began. "I said dismissed," the voice barked again. The escorts, in unison, made an about face and all but marched away. So, should we try to run away since no one's guarding us now? Tessa wondered. Maybe if we did something to disable the cameras wherever they are. She tried to catch Gideon's or Deck's gaze, tried to signal that the three of them could make some plan, work together. But Gideon and Deck were already stepping forward, entering the doorway. They're smarter than me, Tessa thought. They know what's possible and what isn't. She gulped and stepped through the doorway after them.